Zexhai stared at the assignment datapad with 3 of his 4 eyes, while the 4th watched the door to his small office. The message from High Command was short but clear. He was being sent to observe humans in battle. The Catherian Empire wanted to know what these new allies could do in a fight. Zexhai had spent 12 years analyzing enemy fleet movements and writing reports that nobody seemed to read. This assignment felt different. This assignment felt important. The briefing room on Catheria Prime was filled with senior officers, who all looked more qualified than Zexhai. Admiral Vextor stood at the front of the room with her usual stern expression. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded fleets across 3 star systems. She explained that the Valdran hegemony was preparing for a major offensive. The coalition needed every advantage they could find. Earth had joined the alliance 6 months ago, but their military capabilities remained largely unknown. Zexhai learned that humans were a young species. They had only discovered faster than light travel 40 years ago. Their technology was basic compared to most galactic civilizations. What made them interesting was their rapid adaptation to new situations. Early reports suggested they approached warfare differently than other species. The Empire needed detailed observations of human combat tactics and psychological responses under pressure. The journey to human space took 8 days aboard a Catherian diplomatic vessel. Zexhai spent the time reviewing what little information existed about humans. They were bipedal mammals from a world they called Earth. They had only 1 heart and breathed oxygen like most civilized species. Their average lifespan was roughly 80 Earth years, which seemed remarkably short. What puzzled Zexhai most was their social structure. Humans appeared to form emotional bonds with individuals outside their immediate genetic family. This behavior was unusual among galactic species. The human fleet staging area near Jupiter was smaller than Zexhai expected. Perhaps 200 vessels of various sizes floated in formation around the massive gas giant. Most of the ships looked functional rather than elegant. Human engineering seemed to prioritize effectiveness over aesthetic appeal. The UNS Liberty was a mid-sized cruiser that would serve as Zexhai's observation platform. From the outside, it looked like a collection of rectangular modules welded together with weapon systems attached wherever space allowed. Captain Jake Morrison met Zexhai at the airlock. The human was shorter than expected, with graying hair and lines around his eyes that suggested either age or stress. Morrison's handshake was firm but brief. He spoke in the common galactic language with a slight accent that Zexhai found oddly pleasant. Morrison explained that the Liberty carried 800 crew members and was equipped for both fleet operations and independent missions. The ship's interior was cramped by Catherian standards but appeared well organized. Human crew members moved through the corridors with casual efficiency. They wore simple uniforms that looked more like work clothes than military dress. Many of them nodded politely to Zexhai as they passed. Their behavior seemed relaxed for a military vessel preparing for war. Commander Lisa Park was introduced as the ship's tactical officer. She was younger than Morrison, with short dark hair and intense eyes that seemed to analyze everything around her. Park explained the Liberty's weapon systems and defensive capabilities in precise technical language. The ship carried plasma cannons, missile launchers, and defensive screens that were standard for vessels of its class. Nothing about the technology seemed particularly advanced or innovative. Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Davis commanded the ship's Marine contingent. He was a large man with scarred hands who spoke in short, direct sentences. Davis showed Zexhai the Marine quarters and training facilities. The humans had converted several cargo bays into combat simulation areas where soldiers practiced fighting, in various environments. What struck Zexhai was how the Marines trained in small teams rather than large formations. Each team seemed to operate independently while maintaining coordination with the larger unit. The crew quarters were surprisingly personal for a military vessel. Individual living spaces contained photographs, small decorative items, and personal belongings that served no obvious functional purpose. Zexhai asked Morrison about this unusual practice. The captain explained that humans performed better when they felt connected to home and family. Allowing personal items helped maintain morale during long deployments. Chief Engineer Pete Collins gave Zexhai a tour of the engine room. Collins was an older human with permanent grease stains on his uniform. and a habit of explaining complex systems in simple terms. He showed obvious pride in maintaining the Liberty's power systems and seemed to view the ship's mechanical components as living entities that required care and attention. This emotional attachment to technology was another behavior HFY found difficult to understand. The ship's medical bay was larger than expected for a vessel the Liberty's size. Dr. Amy Foster explained that human physiology required more medical support than most species. Humans were apparently prone to various injuries and illnesses that could affect combat effectiveness. Foster showed HFY surgical equipment designed to treat trauma injuries that would be fatal to most galactic species. The implication was that humans expected to sustain serious damage in combat, but planned to continue fighting anyway. Morrison invited HFY to observe the bridge. During routine operations, the command center was smaller than a Catherian bridge but seemed more interactive. Human officers called out information and updates constantly. Morrison responded to questions and gave orders in a conversational tone that would be considered inappropriate aboard a Catherian vessel. Despite the casual atmosphere, the bridge crew appeared competent and well-coordinated. During the evening meals, HFY observed human social behavior in the ship's mess hall. Crew members from different departments sat together and engaged in what appeared to be recreational conversation. They discussed topics unrelated to their duties, including family members, entertainment, and personal interests. This social mixing between ranks and specializations was unprecedented in HFY's experience. Catherian military personnel maintained strict hierarchical separation during off-duty hours. Morrison joined HFY for the meal and answered questions about human military philosophy. The captain explained that human forces relied heavily on individual initiative and adaptability. Orders provided general objectives, but individual commanders were expected to use their judgment in achieving those goals. This approach seemed chaotic to HFY, who was accustomed to detailed operational plans and rigid command structures. As the Liberty prepared to depart for its assigned patrol sector, HFY felt both curious and skeptical about his upcoming observations. The humans seemed pleasant enough, but their casual approach to military discipline was concerning. Their technology was adequate, but not impressive. Their social behaviors were interesting, but potentially counterproductive in combat situations. HFY settled into his assigned quarters, wondering if these strange mammals would prove effective when facing actual enemy forces. The UNS Liberty dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Kepler 442 system 3 days after leaving the staging area. HFY was on the bridge observing routine sensor sweeps when the first distress signal arrived. A convoy of refugee ships was under attack by Valdran raiders near the fourth planet. Morrison listened to the transmission with a grim expression, while Commander Park analyzed the tactical situation on her displays. 3 Valdran destroyers were attacking 6 civilian transports carrying families fleeing the war zone. The refugee ships had minimal weapons and no military escort. Park reported that the nearest coalition patrol was 4 hours away. Morrison studied the tactical display for exactly 30 seconds before ordering the Liberty to intercept. HFY was surprised by the speed of the decision. Catherian commanders would have spent at least an hour analyzing the situation and requesting additional support. Park plotted a course that would bring the Liberty into weapons range in 18 minutes. Morrison activated the ship-wide communication system and informed the crew they were heading into combat. His announcement was brief and matter-of-fact. Crew members responded by moving to battle stations with practiced efficiency. The casual atmosphere HFY had observed during routine operations disappeared completely. Within minutes, the Liberty had transformed into a focused military weapon. Chief Collins reported from engineering that all systems were operating at full capacity. The weapons officer confirmed that plasma cannons and missile tubes were ready for engagement. Dr. Foster announced that the medical bay was prepared for casualties. Morrison acknowledged each report with a simple nod. HFY noticed that the captain's relaxed demeanor had been replaced by intense concentration. The Liberty approached the battle zone using a small asteroid field for cover. Park coordinated the approach while monitoring Valdran ship movements. The enemy vessels were larger and more heavily armed than the Liberty, but they appeared focused on destroying the refugee ships rather than watching for military intervention. Morrison waited until the human ship was within optimal firing range before revealing their position. The first engagement happened faster than HFY expected. Park targeted the nearest Valdran destroyer with a coordinated missile and plasma cannon attack. The enemy ship's shields absorbed most of the damage, but several hits penetrated to the hull. The Valdran commander responded by turning his 3 ships toward the Liberty, while the refugee vessels scattered in different directions. What followed was unlike any battle HFY had witnessed in simulation or historical records. Morrison did not attempt to fight a conventional engagement against superior numbers. Instead, he ordered a series of aggressive maneuvers designed to keep the enemy ships focused on the Liberty while the civilians escaped. Park calculated firing solutions while the ship twisted through space at velocities that pushed the crew against their seats. The Liberty took heavy damage during the first exchange. Valdran plasma bolts penetrated the forward shields and caused explosions throughout the front section of the ship. Collins reported power fluctuations and hull breaches in 3 compartments. Morrison ordered damage control teams to make repairs, while continuing the engagement. HFY watched human crew members run toward damaged areas instead of away from them. Lieutenant Colonel Davis and his Marines were deployed to defend critical ship systems. When a Valdran boarding torpedo penetrated the hull near the engineering section, Davis led his team into direct combat with enemy soldiers inside the Liberty. The fighting was brutal and personal in a way that shocked HFY. Humans and Valdrans killed each other with weapons designed for close-range combat, while the ship shook from external explosions. Chief Collins coordinated repairs while sections of his engineering department were exposed to space. Human technicians worked to restore power systems while wearing emergency pressure suits and dodging debris from ongoing explosions. Several crew members were injured by flying metal fragments, but continued working until replacement teams could take over. Collins himself was caught in a plasma fire that burned his left arm, but refused medical treatment until the main engines were operational. Commander Park maintained tactical coordination, despite a head injury that left blood running down her face. She calculated targeting solutions and coordinated with damage control teams, while emergency lights flashed throughout the bridge. Morrison remained in his command chair, even when a console explosion filled the air with smoke and electrical sparks. The human command team continued functioning under conditions that would have incapacitated most Catherian crews. The battle turned when Park identified a weakness in the Valdran formation. One of the enemy destroyers had moved too far from its companions while pursuing a refugee ship. Morrison ordered a concentrated attack on the isolated vessel, using the Liberty's remaining missiles and emergency power reserves. The combined strike overwhelmed the Valdran ship's defenses and caused a reactor breach that destroyed the vessel completely. The loss of one destroyer caused the remaining Valdran ships to withdraw from the engagement. They had accomplished their primary mission of terrorizing civilian populations and saw no benefit in continuing a fight against a determined military opponent. Morrison did not pursue the retreating enemy vessels. Instead, he ordered immediate rescue operations for the damaged refugee ships. The aftermath of the battle revealed the true cost of the engagement. 12 members of the Liberty's crew had been killed, and 37 others required medical treatment. The ship's forward section was heavily damaged and would require extensive repairs. Several critical systems were operating at reduced capacity. By any rational military analysis, the Liberty had suffered a tactical defeat, despite achieving its immediate objective. HFY observed the human response to their casualties with growing confusion. Morrison held a brief ceremony for the dead crew members in the ship's main cargo bay. The captain spoke about each person individually, mentioning their service record and personal qualities. Other crew members shared memories and stories about their fallen comrades. The ceremony was emotional in a way that made HFY uncomfortable. What disturbed the Catherian observer most was the immediate transition from mourning to preparation for the next mission. Within hours of the memorial service, human crew members were working to repair battle damage and restore ship systems. They showed grief for their lost friends, but did not allow that grief to interfere with their duties. This emotional compartmentalization was unlike anything in HFY's cultural experience. The rescued refugees included families with young children who had been traveling to safety when the Valdran attack began. Zexhai watched Davis and his Marines distribute their personal food rations to hungry refugee children. The humans shared their own supplies without being ordered to do so. They seemed to view caring for civilians as a natural extension of their military duties. Dr. Foster worked 18 straight hours treating injured refugees in addition to Liberty crew members. She performed surgical procedures on species she had never encountered before, using medical knowledge adapted from human physiology. When Zexhai asked about her motivation, Foster explained that helping injured people was simply what doctors did. The concept of limiting medical care based on species or military necessity seemed foreign to her. Chief Collins spent 3 days rebuilding damaged systems with whatever materials he could find aboard the refugee ships. He worked with engineers from 4 different species to jury-rig repairs that would keep the Liberty operational until they reached a proper shipyard. Collins approached each engineering challenge as an interesting puzzle rather than a frustrating obstacle. His enthusiasm for solving technical problems remained high despite his injuries and exhaustion. Morrison filed his battle report as a minor engagement with acceptable casualties and mission success. He recommended several crew members for commendations but did not request additional support or suggest changes to operational procedures. The captain treated the battle as a routine example of the Liberty's capabilities rather than an exceptional demonstration of human courage. As the Liberty limped toward the nearest coalition base, Zexhai struggled to process what he had witnessed. The humans had fought with creativity and determination that exceeded their technological limitations. They had accepted heavy casualties to protect strangers they would never see again. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to view their sacrifice as normal military behavior rather than extraordinary heroism. Zexhai began to suspect that his assignment would be more challenging than High Command had anticipated. Understanding human military capabilities would require more than observing their weapons and tactics. It would require comprehending a species that approached warfare from fundamentally different psychological and cultural perspectives than any other race in the galaxy. The emergency signal reached the Liberty, while Chief Collins was still making repairs to the forward weapons array. Zexhai was in the observation lounge reviewing his notes when Captain Morrison's voice echoed through the ship's communication system. All off-duty personnel were ordered to report to their stations immediately. The tone in Morrison's voice suggested this was not a routine alert. Zexhai hurried to the bridge and found the command crew studying a tactical display that showed the Kepler 442b colony under direct assault. 30 Valdran warships had jumped into the system and were beginning orbital bombardment of the human settlement. 3 million civilians lived on the planet's surface with only basic defensive installations. Commander Park estimated that the colony would fall within 6 hours without immediate military intervention. Coalition Fleet Command had ordered the Liberty to rendezvous with 7 other human vessels for a relief mission. Morrison pulled up the force composition on his display and studied it with a grim expression. 8 human ships against 30 Valdran warships was not a battle that could be won through conventional tactics. Park calculated various engagement scenarios and reported that every simulation ended with the complete destruction of the human relief force. Morrison called a brief meeting with his senior officers in the conference room adjacent to the bridge. Zexhai was permitted to observe as the humans discussed their options. Lieutenant Colonel Davis suggested that the relief force could conduct hit-and-run attacks to delay the Valdran assault. Dr. Foster pointed out that delaying tactics would only postpone the inevitable massacre of civilian populations. Chief Collins proposed using the human ships as decoys to draw Valdran forces away from the planet. What struck Zexhai was that none of the human officers suggested withdrawing from the mission. The tactical situation was hopeless and engaging. The enemy would almost certainly result in the destruction of all human forces. Yet the discussion focused entirely on how to maximize damage to the enemy and protect civilian lives. The possibility of preserving the human ships by avoiding combat was never mentioned. Morrison ended the meeting by accepting the mission despite its suicidal nature. He explained to his officers that abandoning 3 million civilians was not an acceptable option, regardless of the military cost. The captain's decision was supported unanimously by his staff. Zexhai listened to this exchange with growing disbelief. These humans were choosing certain death to protect people they had never met. The Liberty joined the relief force at the edge of the Kepler 442 system 6 hours later. The other human ships included 2 destroyers, 3 frigates, and 2 support vessels. Captain Alex Turner of the destroyer UNS Ranger served as mission commander. Turner's briefing was delivered over a secure communication channel to all ship captains and senior officers. Turner explained that the relief force could not defeat the Valdran fleet in direct combat. Instead, they would execute a series of coordinated attacks designed to disrupt the enemy bombardment and buy time for civilian evacuations. Each human ship would be assigned specific targets and objectives that maximized damage to Valdran forces while drawing enemy attention away from the planet's surface. The plan required individual ship commanders to make independent tactical decisions based on rapidly changing battle conditions. Turner emphasized that preserving human ships was secondary to protecting civilian populations. If a captain determined that sacrificing his vessel would save more lives, he was authorized to make that decision without requesting permission from higher command. Zexai watched the human captains accept these orders without protest or hesitation. They discussed technical details and coordination procedures, but no one questioned the fundamental assumption that their ships and crews were expendable resources. This casual acceptance of suicide missions was unlike anything in Catherian military doctrine. The relief force approached the battle zone using a complex formation that spread the human ships across multiple attack vectors. Morrison positioned the Liberty to assault the Valdran command vessel, while other ships targeted support vessels and bombardment platforms. Park coordinated with the other human tactical officers to ensure maximum disruption of enemy operations. The battle began when Captain Turner deliberately rammed the UNS Ranger into a Valdran dreadnought that was preparing to destroy a civilian evacuation site. The collision destroyed both ships in a massive explosion that lit up the space around the planet. Turner's sacrifice eliminated the most dangerous enemy vessel and created debris that interfered with Valdran targeting systems. What followed was 18 hours of combat that redefined Zexai's understanding of warfare. The human ships fought with tactics that violated every principle of rational military doctrine. When conventional weapons proved insufficient, human crews improvised solutions that ranged from brilliant to terrifying. Captain Maria Gonzalez of the UNS Dakota discovered that her ship's reactor had been damaged beyond repair. Instead of withdrawing from the battle, she ordered her crew to abandon ship while she manually overloaded the reactor core. The resulting explosion destroyed 3 Valdran vessels and created an electromagnetic pulse that disabled several others. Commander, Park calculated targeting solutions while tears streamed down her face. She coordinated with damage control teams to maintain weapon systems even as sections of the Liberty were torn apart by enemy fire. Park continued providing tactical analysis until a console explosion left her unconscious and bleeding. Morrison took over her duties while directing medical teams to treat her injuries. Chief Collins worked in engineering sections that had been breached and exposed to space. He and his team wore emergency pressure suits while repairing power systems. Under direct enemy fire, Collins rewired critical circuits with his bare hands while Valdran plasma bolts melted bulkheads around him. When asked why he took such risks, Collins explained that the ship needed power to continue fighting. Lieutenant Colonel Davis led a boarding action against the Valdran flagship that was coordinating the planetary bombardment. His Marines fought room by room through the enemy vessel using weapons and tactics designed for close-quarters combat. Davis personally planted a nuclear device in the ship's reactor core and triggered it manually rather than risk the timer being discovered and disarmed. Dr. Foster converted the Liberty's cargo bays into emergency medical facilities for treating casualties from other human ships. She performed surgery on wounded crew members while the ship maneuvered violently to avoid enemy fire. Foster operated on patients during combat conditions that would make most medical procedures impossible. Morrison commanded the Liberty from a bridge that had been half destroyed by enemy weapons. Emergency lighting provided the only illumination, while smoke and electrical fires filled the air around the command stations. Morrison coordinated with other human ships using communication systems that Collins had jury-rigged from damaged components. The turning point came when Morrison realized that the Liberty's engines had been destroyed and the ship was losing life support throughout most of its sections. Instead of ordering a general evacuation, he directed his crew to abandon ship while he remained at the helm. Morrison piloted the crippled vessel directly into the largest Valdran battleship and triggered a reactor overload that destroyed both vessels. HFY watched Morrison's final sacrifice from an escape pod that had been launched during the general evacuation. The captain's collision eliminated the Valdran command structure and caused enough confusion among the enemy fleet that the remaining ships withdrew from the system. The human relief mission had succeeded, but at a cost that staggered the alien observer. Of the original force of 6,000 human crew members, only 847 survived the battle. 3 entire ships had been lost with all hands. The remaining vessels were so badly damaged that they would never fight again. By any conventional military analysis, the engagement had been a catastrophic defeat for human forces. Yet the mission had achieved its primary objective. The Valdran bombardment had been stopped, and civilian evacuations had been completed successfully. 2.8 million people had been saved through the sacrifice of human military personnel, who chose to die rather than allow innocent civilians to be murdered. During the journey back to human space, HFY struggled to comprehend what he had witnessed. The humans had not simply fought bravely against overwhelming odds. They had systematically sacrificed their ships and crews as tactical weapons. Individual commanders had made split-second decisions to die in order to inflict maximum damage on enemy forces. Most disturbing of all, the surviving humans did not view their sacrifices as extraordinary. When HFY attempted to interview crew members about their experiences, they expressed grief for lost friends but showed no regret about the tactical decisions that had led to those deaths. They seemed to view protecting civilians as a natural extension of their military duties that required no special justification. Chief Collins, who had lost both legs during the final battle, spent his recovery time designing improvements to human ship safety systems. He analyzed the battle damage reports with scientific detachment and proposed engineering modifications that would make future vessels more survivable. The rescue vessel UNS Mercy carried 847 human survivors toward Coalition space, while HFY struggled to process what he had witnessed. The ship's medical bays were filled with injured crew members from the destroyed vessels. Dr. Foster worked alongside other medical officers to treat wounds that ranged from minor burns to traumatic amputations. What disturbed HFY most was how quietly the humans endured their suffering. Chief Collins had been fitted with temporary prosthetic legs that allowed him to move around the ship. Instead of focusing on his own recovery, Collins spent his time interviewing other survivors about equipment failures during the battle. He collected detailed technical reports about weapon malfunctions and life support breakdowns. Collins treated each equipment failure as a learning opportunity that could improve future ship designs. Commander Park had recovered from her head injury but bore permanent scars across her left temple where console fragments had cut her face. She worked with other surviving tactical officers to compile a comprehensive analysis of human performance during the engagement. Park studied battle recordings and damage reports with scientific precision that seemed disconnected from the traumatic events she had experienced. Lieutenant Colonel Davis had died during his boarding action against the Valdran flagship. The surviving Marines spoke about their commander with quiet respect, but showed no obvious emotional distress. Sergeant Kevin Brooks, who had taken over Davis's duties, explained that losing leaders in combat was an expected part of military service. The Marines seemed to view their commander's sacrifice as honorable rather than tragic. What puzzled HFY was the survivors' matter-of-fact attitude toward their recent experiences. These humans had watched friends die in horrible ways while fighting a hopeless battle against overwhelming enemy forces. Yet they discussed the engagement as if analyzing a training exercise. Their emotional responses seemed disconnected from the severity of what they had endured. During the voyage, HFY conducted informal interviews with crew members from different ships and departments. A young engineer named Tony Clark had watched his entire section chief die when a plasma conduit exploded during the battle. Clark described the incident in technical terms while explaining how the explosion could have been prevented with better shielding materials. He showed no signs of psychological trauma despite witnessing gruesome deaths. Weapons Officer Nancy Wright had manually targeted enemy vessels, while her own ship was breaking apart around her. Wright calculated firing solutions until the exact moment her station lost power, and she was evacuated to an escape pod. She discussed her targeting decisions with professional pride, while describing how human weapons could be modified for better effectiveness against Valdrin armor. Medical technician Gary Moore had treated wounded personnel in a field hospital that had been set up in a damaged cargo bay. Moore performed emergency surgery on critically injured patients while enemy weapons, fire penetrated the hull around him. He spoke about the experience as an interesting challenge that had improved his medical skills under extreme conditions. Every human survivor Zexhai interviewed displayed the same pattern of behavior. They acknowledged the deaths of their comrades with genuine sadness, but viewed those sacrifices as necessary and appropriate given the circumstances. None of them questioned the tactical decisions that had led to massive human casualties. They seemed to accept that protecting civilians justified any military cost. This acceptance of sacrifice as normal military procedure was unlike anything in Catherian culture. Catherian military doctrine emphasized preserving trained personnel and expensive equipment whenever possible. Suicide missions were considered wasteful and counterproductive. The idea of deliberately sacrificing military assets to protect civilian populations was completely foreign to Catherian strategic thinking. Zexhai decided to research human historical records to better understand their approach to warfare. The ship's database contained extensive files on human civilization and military history. What he discovered filled him with growing alarm about the species he was supposed to analyze. Human history was filled with examples of individuals and small groups sacrificing themselves for strangers or abstract principles. Soldiers had deliberately died to protect their comrades or civilian populations throughout human civilization. This pattern of self-sacrifice appeared in human cultures across different time periods and geographical regions. The historical records contained detailed accounts of human military actions that defied rational strategic analysis. Individual soldiers had thrown themselves on explosive devices to protect their units. Ship captains had rammed enemy vessels to prevent attacks on civilian targets. Entire military units had fought to the death rather than retreat and expose non-combatants to enemy forces. What made these historical examples particularly disturbing was how human societies celebrated such sacrifices. Heroes who died protecting others were honored with monuments and ceremonies. Stories of self-sacrifice were passed down through generations as examples of proper behavior. Human culture actively encouraged individuals to value others' lives above their own survival. Zexhai found records of a human military conflict called World War II, where these patterns had been displayed on a massive scale. Human forces had repeatedly accepted enormous casualties to achieve objectives that had little immediate tactical value. Soldiers had stormed fortified positions, knowing they would likely die in order to advance strategic goals or protect civilian populations. The historical analysis revealed that human approach to warfare was fundamentally different from other galactic species. Most civilizations fought to acquire resources or territory, or to defend their existing holdings. Humans appeared to fight for abstract concepts like freedom and justice that could not be measured in conventional terms. Even more concerning was the human tendency to escalate conflicts rather than negotiate when their core values were threatened. The historical records showed numerous examples of human societies choosing total war over compromise when they believed fundamental principles were at stake. This willingness to accept unlimited costs for ideological reasons made humans unpredictable and potentially dangerous allies or enemies. Dr. Foster joined Zexhai in the ship's library while he was reviewing these historical files. She noticed his obvious distress and asked if she could help with his research. Zexhai explained that he was trying to understand why humans were willing to sacrifice themselves for people they had never met. Foster's response was simple and terrifying in its implications. Foster explained that humans formed emotional connections not just with individuals they knew personally, but with abstract groups they considered part of their extended community. Civilians in danger were not strangers to be protected for strategic reasons, but family members whose safety was a personal responsibility. The concept of abandoning helpless people was so morally repugnant to humans that they would choose death rather than live with such shame. This psychological framework explained the behavior Zexai had observed during the recent battle. The human crews had not calculated the strategic value of saving civilian lives against the cost of military casualties. They had responded to an emotional imperative that made civilian deaths personally unacceptable, regardless of tactical considerations. Chief Collins confirmed this analysis during a conversation about engineering priorities. Collins explained that human spacecraft were designed with extensive life support redundancy because losing crew members was considered a design failure rather than an acceptable operational cost. Human engineers viewed protecting human life as their primary responsibility, regardless of efficiency or resource constraints. Commander Park provided similar insights about human tactical doctrine. Park explained that human commanders were trained to accept personal responsibility for the safety of both their own forces and any civilians in the operational area. Military success was measured not just by achieving objectives but by minimizing casualties among all human personnel, including non-combatants. These conversations revealed that human military culture was built around protecting life rather than achieving victory. Strategic objectives were important but secondary to the fundamental goal of keeping people alive. This prioritization of humanitarian concerns over tactical efficiency was unprecedented in Zexai's understanding of military organizations. The rescue ship reached Coalition space 12 days after departing the battle zone. Zexai watched the human survivors transfer to medical facilities and replacement assignments with the same quiet efficiency they had displayed throughout their ordeal. They showed no signs of psychological trauma despite experiencing combat that would have broken most other species. As Zexai prepared to return to Cytherian space, he realized that his assignment had become far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Understanding human military capabilities required comprehending a species that approached warfare from fundamentally different psychological and cultural perspectives than any other race in the galaxy. The humans were not simply effective fighters with unusual tactics. They were a species that had evolved a social structure based on protecting others regardless of personal cost. Zexai sat in his office on Cytheria Prime, staring at a blank report template on his desk screen. 3 weeks had passed since his return from human space, but he still could not find words to describe what he had witnessed. How could he explain to the Empire's military leadership that humans treated suicide missions as standard operating procedure? How could he convey the terrifying implications of fighting alongside a species that valued strangers' lives above their own survival? His first attempt at writing the report had been rejected by Admiral Vextor within hours of submission. The Admiral's response was brief and dismissive. She wrote that Zexai's observations were clearly influenced by emotional trauma and lacked the objective analysis required for military intelligence. The Admiral requested a revised report focusing on concrete assessments of human technology and conventional tactical capabilities. Zexai rewrote the report 3 times, trying to present his observations in terms that Cytherian commanders could understand. Each version was returned with similar criticisms. The military leadership refused to accept that any species would deliberately choose massive casualties to protect non-combatants. They demanded quantifiable data about human weapon systems and fleet compositions rather than psychological analysis. The breakthrough came when Admiral Vextor summoned Zexai for a personal interview in her office. She wanted to understand why a trained intelligence analyst was submitting reports that read like emotional fiction rather than military assessment. Zexai attempted to explain that human military doctrine could not be understood through conventional analysis because it was based on principles that violated all established theories of rational warfare. Admiral Vextor listened to Zexai's explanation with obvious skepticism. She pointed out that no species in galactic history had survived by prioritizing individual altruism over collective survival. Military forces that accepted unlimited casualties would exhaust their personnel and equipment resources quickly. The Admiral insisted that human behavior must follow predictable patterns that could be analyzed using standard military models. Zexai realized that his superiors were fundamentally incapable of comprehending what he had observed. Cytherian military culture was based on preserving trained personnel and expensive equipment. The concept of deliberately sacrificing strategic assets to protect civilians was so foreign to Catherian thinking that they literally could not process the information. His warnings about human psychology were being dismissed as impossible rather than evaluated as intelligence data. The impasse was resolved when reports began arriving from other sectors where human forces were engaged in combat operations. Coalition. Commanders submitted detailed accounts of human tactical decisions that confirmed Zexhi's observations. Human ships were deliberately ramming enemy vessels to protect civilian evacuations. Human ground forces were accepting complete destruction rather than retreating from defensive positions around population centers. What made these reports particularly disturbing was their tone of bewildered admiration. Experienced military officers from multiple species described human actions that violated every principle of tactical logic, yet achieved strategic objectives through sheer determination. The pattern was consistent across different commanders and operational theaters. Humans fought with a psychological commitment that exceeded their technological capabilities. Admiral Vextor called an emergency briefing for senior intelligence personnel to analyze the accumulating reports about human military behavior. The meeting included representatives from 6 different species who had observed human forces in combat. Each observer described similar patterns of behavior that defied conventional military analysis. The evidence was overwhelming that humans approached warfare differently than any other known species. The briefing revealed that human tactical innovations were spreading throughout coalition forces. Other species were beginning to adopt human techniques for protecting civilian populations during military operations. More concerning was evidence that exposure to human military culture was changing the behavior of non-human personnel. Coalition. Forces were becoming more willing to accept casualties to achieve humanitarian objectives. High Command realized that understanding human psychology was critical for managing coalition military operations. Zexhi was reassigned to lead a comprehensive study of human military culture, with unlimited access to intelligence resources. His new mission was to develop tactical models that could predict and coordinate with human forces, rather than simply analyzing their capabilities. The expanded research project revealed patterns that filled Zexhi with growing dread about the galaxy's future. Human influence on coalition strategy was subtle but pervasive. Military operations were increasingly focused on protecting civilian populations rather than achieving traditional strategic objectives. This shift in priorities was making the coalition more effective at winning popular support, but less efficient at conventional warfare. More troubling was evidence that human psychological patterns were spreading to other species through extended contact. Personnel who served alongside humans for extended periods began displaying similar willingness to accept personal risk for abstract principles. This behavioral modification appeared to be permanent and was spreading through coalition forces, like a cultural infection. The main Galactic War began 6 months after Zexhi submitted his final report on human military psychology. The Valdran hegemony launched simultaneous attacks on coalition worlds across 3 sectors. Their strategy was based on traditional military doctrine that assumed rational opponents would negotiate rather than accept unlimited casualties to defend non-strategic targets. The Valdran plan involved capturing civilian population centers and using them as leverage to force coalition surrender. This approach had been successful against other species who could be convinced to trade territory for lives. The hegemony's strategists had not anticipated how humans would respond to threats against non-combatant populations. Human reaction to Valdran attacks on civilians was swift and terrifying. Every ship in the human fleet was immediately reassigned to combat operations regardless of maintenance schedules or crew readiness. Human ground forces abandoned defensive positions to launch counterattacks against enemy units that had captured civilian areas. Most disturbing of all, human commanders began authorizing tactical decisions that would have been considered war crimes under normal circumstances. Zexhi monitored the escalating conflict from coalition intelligence headquarters with growing horror. Human forces were conducting boarding actions against Valdran ships and detonating nuclear weapons manually, rather than risk the enemy escaping. Human pilots were ramming fighter craft into enemy formations when their weapons were exhausted. Human ground troops were charging fortified positions with explosive devices rather than accepting civilian casualties from prolonged sieges. The war became a nightmare spiral, where Valdrin tactical victories only increased human determination to inflict retribution. Each civilian death created soldiers willing to attempt missions that would have been considered impossible under normal circumstances. Human tactics became increasingly innovative and desperate as they developed new methods for maximizing damage to enemy forces regardless of personal cost. Coalition intelligence reports described human innovations that violated basic principles of military engineering. Human crews were converting civilian spacecraft into improvised weapons by loading them with explosives and ramming enemy vessels. Human engineers were developing new types of ammunition designed to maximize casualties among enemy personnel rather than destroying equipment. Human commanders were authorizing chemical and biological weapons that had been banned by galactic conventions. What made the situation more terrifying was how other coalition species began adopting human tactics. Exposure to human military culture was changing the behavior of non-human forces. Species that had previously fought according to rational strategic principles were beginning to prioritize revenge and humanitarian concerns over tactical efficiency. The Valdrin hegemony's military leadership realized too late that their strategy had backfired catastrophically. Instead of forcing coalition surrender through civilian casualties, they had triggered a psychological response that made negotiated peace impossible. Human forces would continue fighting until every Valdrin military unit was destroyed, regardless of the cost to coalition resources. The war ended not through traditional victory, but through Valdrin surrender, when their leadership realized that continuing the conflict would result in the complete destruction of their civilization. Human willingness to accept unlimited casualties for ideological principles made them impossible to defeat through conventional military pressure. The hegemony chose capitulation over extinction. In his final report on the conflict, Zexhai wrote, a warning that would circulate through galactic intelligence networks for generations. He described humans as a species that fought not just with weapons, but with psychological commitment that could not be measured in conventional terms. Their approach to warfare was based on principles that made negotiation impossible once their core values were threatened.